Broadcasting from the United States Institute of Peace in Washington, D.C., this is The Peace Frequency, a podcast series searching for ways to create a world free of violent conflict. The Peace Frequency is produced by the Global Campus, which is USIP's online learning platform designed to strengthen your peace-building skills through distance learning courses, multimedia toolkits, and virtual live events. You can learn more about the Global Campus at usipglobalcampus.org. I am your host, Darren Cambridge. On today's show, we speak with Kerri Kennedy. She is the Associate General Secretary for International Programs at the American Friends Service Committee, a Quaker organization that promotes lasting peace with justice as a practical expression of faith in action. Kerri has near 2 decades of experience managing international development and emergency response programs in areas of conflict and post-conflict environments, with a focus on inclusive governance systems, civic education and advocacy campaigns, gender and rights-based policy development. She was a Peace Corps volunteer in the Kingdom of Tonga, and she has worked in more than 40 countries, including Liberia, Ethiopia, Afghanistan, and Timor-Leste, to support women in parliament, multi-party democracy systems, and peace-building processes. So, Kerri, thanks for joining us in the studio today.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
And welcome to those of you who are listening from around the world. We invite all of our listeners to share their questions and their comments with us throughout the show. So if you're listening to this broadcast on the USIP Global Campus website, you can post your questions and comments in the discussion forum, which you find at the bottom of the page, or you can tweet us your questions using the hashtag Peace Frequency. Again, that's hashtag Peace Frequency. And if you came across this episode on Facebook, you can also post your questions on the Facebook post, and we will weave them into this interview. So, Kerri, let's get started. This is a real honor to kind of sit down and have this time with you. We know each other from a project that we're working on, looking at the history of AFSC, Quaker Peace Building. You were here at USIP a little over a year ago.
Yep.
We had an event that looked at the intersection of peace building and civil resistance and nonviolent action. So that was fascinating. So we're going to get into all of that and even more of that. But we start each of these episodes with a segment that I've started calling Behind the Bio. And I'm going to ask you a question that is going to provide us a window into your history, your story, your personality that you wouldn't necessarily find searching your name on the internet or on any website. So the question that I have for you in this segment is, if you could pick any moment in your life from birth to present day, and you could capture that moment in a painting, and then you hung that painting above your bed, so it was the first thing you saw when you woke up in the morning and the last thing you saw when you went to bed at night, what would that moment be and why?
That is a very difficult question. There are so many moments. But I think that one moment I think that stayed with me, a memory that I have that really stayed with me, and it has informed my life and especially my professional career, is when I was actually leaving the Peace Corps. I was in the Kingdom of Tonga, a very small, beautiful island in the South Pacific. And I was on a tiny island called Niuatopatapu, which was about 1,000 people. It was very remote. A plane came every 6 weeks. You could take a boat there. There was only 1,000 people on the island, and it was 6 square meters, so quite small. And I went there thinking, I was young. I was right after college in my 20s, and thinking I have so much to teach and to learn, but more to I have so much to say. And the memory that I have is when I was leaving, the community threw this wonderful feast for me on this beautiful beach in the South Pacific. And they did a skit. So the whole village that I lived in did this skit where they acted out me. They pretended to be Kerri. And so they acted as me arriving, which was this baby who couldn't speak Tongan, couldn't light a kerosene lantern, couldn't clean a fish, couldn't do anything that was necessary to survive in this country. And then they showed the progression of me after being there for 2.5 years, and did this wonderful skit about me leaving as this Tongan woman who could do all of these things within the Tongan community. And it really stuck with me because that was the moment where it reminded me that I wasn't ever there to teach. I was always there to learn and to have those human connections. And it reminds me of community and the value of working together and learning together. And it was in this beautiful place. So it just reminds me of this moment of transformation and peace in my life.
Mm. So the image would be that skit that they were playing
Yeah,
on.
with the
Okay.
ocean, the Tongan Ocean in the background, and the community, and everyone's dressed in their Tongan dress, and it's just a peaceful, kind of spiritual moment for me.
Have you been back to
I
Tonga
went
since?
back. I went back a few years later and have not been back yet since. And I would actually like to do that at some point with my husband and children. I think that'd be great.
That's great. That's great. All right. Well, thanks for that window behind the bio. Let's go back to the front of the bio.
Yes.
So as I mentioned, your title is the Associate General Secretary of International Programs at AFSC, American Friends Service Committee.
Yes.
It's a lot right there. So tell us, what is the nature of your work in this role? What do you do?
Yes, it is quite a mouthful. And I oversee all of our international programs. So we work in 18 countries. That includes the United States. We have a little over 400 staff, 110 of whom are placed in those 17 countries around the world, excluding the United States. So I oversee the regional directors. I set the strategic direction for the international programs. I do a lot of crisis management. I provide programmatic leadership and really try to look for strategic opportunities for us to transform systems of oppression and really to dedicate our work towards empowering communities for sustainable peace.
So you said 18 countries.
18 countries, and that includes the United States. So under my portfolio is 17, and 17 of some of the most conflict-affected countries in the world. So we work in North Korea, we work in Somalia, we work in Guatemala, Haiti, and Palestine. We tend to go into a country and commit to staying there for a long time to try to transform a conflict or to try to create some kind of peace. And yeah, so we are in 4 regions around the world. We have 4 regional capitals, one in Guatemala, one in Jerusalem, moving to Amman, Jordan, one in Cambodia and Phnom Penh, and one in Nairobi, Kenya.
Okay. So you mentioned that there are 17 countries and then 18th being the United States. You said North Korea was one of them. I was looking at your website and you mentioned some of the countries that I saw there. North Korea, I wanted to talk about that.
Yeah, sure.
My understanding is that very few people are able to even go into North Korea.
Yes.
So how does AFSC get access, and what kind of work do you all do in that country in particular?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we have been in North Korea for decades, and we are one of the handful of organizations that's allowed actually to have a presence inside the country. And a lot of that comes from our long history there, from the legacy of our work. We actually do agricultural development. So we're working on increasing crop yields for household farms. So there's large cooperative farms, and they have to meet certain yieldages every year. So we look for innovative ways to try to increase that yield. And we've introduced like plastic seed trays and greenhouses and different types of tools that can help to increase the agricultural production. We also then try to link the North Korean farmers with other farmers, like in the United States or in China, so that they can learn from each other. And we also do advocacy around the narrative of U.S. engagement with North Korea. So that is part of our growing focus under our shared security frame, which I'm sure we'll talk about later.
Yeah. So the narrative on North Korea, it's interesting you brought that up. I had a student in a class a couple of years ago who had done some work in North Korea, and he made a similar case to me, saying a lot of what we know about North Korea that we get through mainstream media in the United States is really only part of the story.
Yes.
Have you been to North Korea?
North Korea is one of 2 countries that I have not yet gone to, and I will be going this year. Our country representative, Linda Lewis, who's based in Dalian, China, goes in and out multiple times a year. So we work through partners, so that we have farming partners in North Korea. We have an office in China, and our staff there go in and out.
Okay. And that's like totally loud.
Totally loud, yes. So I will be going. Visitors, we actually, one of our new staff members who is an who works with the Asia advocacy work in DC, actually, I think was just there. So many of our staff go in and out. They do have set visits. So the time you have to go at a certain time in the year, which is why I haven't gone.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So AFSC, as I mentioned earlier, we USIP and AFSC were working on a course that
Yes.
looks at the 100+ year history of AFSC. I want to talk a little bit about the role of Quakers in peace building. As I was thinking about this interview and sitting down with you and thinking about Quaker values and principles and the history of Quakers, the term gadfly came up in my head for some reason, but you can correct me if I'm wrong. But the little that I know about Quakers, particularly here in the United States, I kind of see them as gadflies, not just to the state, but also gadflies to maybe the larger faith community as well. I think what I understand is that the Quaker community has been able to really point at an injustice and say, our faith calls on us to speak out against this and end it. And everyone else who follows similar principles through their faith must also speak out against this. And right now it may not be popular.
Yes.
And this point of view may put us on the margins, may get us in trouble, may put us in jail. But we come from this deep faith, and I want to point out this injustice and speak to it. So would you characterize the Quaker role in history, speaking out against injustice, in the same way?
Yes.
And how are those principles then infused into this now global peace building work?
Yeah, I absolutely think that Quakers for over 350 years since its inception have and there are Quakers all over the world. There's a large population in the United States, but there's a large population in Africa and Latin America. Quakers have always spoke truth to power. So this was a phrase that was coined in 1955 after AFSC published a book around the Cold War, and it is a tradition of Quakerism that you have to seek out, you have to speak against injustice. If you do see something wrong, if you see some kind of oppression, you have to work to dismantle that. And that comes from the long history of fighting for religious freedom. That comes from this idea of that of light or God in everybody. So there is this idea that all of us have this goodness or this calling to be almost divine, and that when we are together in a group, sitting together in silence or trying to figure out a solution to something, we can in fact come up with a solution that's greater than a human person. So it has been, and it's always the calling of Quakers to try to get to that space, to be, of course, Quakers are humans and have their challenges, but it is the aspiration to try to get to this place where you are where you're noticing injustice, articulating, trying to dismantle it, and coming up with solutions of root causes. It sometimes doesn't make our work easy because we're always looking at, if we're doing some kind of humanitarian service, are we band-aiding a problem, or are we really seeking out the root cause of a conflict? And are we contributing to dismantling whatever that issue is and attacking the root cause? It causes a tension. It doesn't allow you to be comfortable ever in your work. You're always questioning, am I doing the right thing? Am I doing enough? And we try, so this has been the history of Quakerism. American Friends Service Committee is an organization that is founded on Quaker values. So we really try to infuse those values into our work and into all of our programmatic assessments and evaluations. It's not enough for us to measure, effectiveness. It's really, are we transforming systems?
So you mentioned earlier that where you operate, where you work, where you have a presence around the world, you try and be there for a long period of time.
Yes.
What do you consider a long period of time to get at these root causes, as you just mentioned?
We've been in the Middle East since after World War II. So we started, since 1947, we actually started doing relief work in Europe and in Germany after World War II. And we won the Nobel Peace Prize for that, American Friends Service Committee, with the British Friends Service Committee on behalf of Quakers worldwide. So we were doing relief work, then started actually the United Nations was created. We went and started doing relief work in Gaza for refugees. AFSC was the organization that started doing the work that UNRWA took over. So we were contracted to do all of the relief work for Gazan refugees, and we're still there today. So a long time for us is 60 plus
You
years.
never leave, right?
but at the same time, one hopes that we leave. So there have been situations where we have left a country. We left Brazil and moved our office to Guatemala because Brazil at that time was relatively stable. We closed an office in Mozambique and transformed that work to a local organization. They're doing very successful work. So we do, if need be, if the conflict persists, we stay and we're committed. We always, though, look for opportunities to be able to help to build peace and then to leave. And we really are careful about what is our role as an external actor and an INGO. We never want to be doing work that a local organization can be doing. So we always want to look at what's our value added to transform systems of oppression and conflict.
You're listening to The Peace Frequency, a podcast series searching for ways to create a world free of violent conflict. I'm your host, Darren Cambridge, and on the show today we have Kerri Kennedy. She's the Associate General Secretary for International Programs at the American Friends Service Committee, a Quaker peace organization. So I want to go back to that skit in Tonga. And you've done many things since that time in the Peace Corps. Now you're in this role at the American Friends Service Committee. You did lots of things in between then. What drew you to AFSC?
Yes. So I've been at AFSC for about 4 years. And after I left the Peace Corps, I was doing development work, so micro entrepreneurship work. I was based in DC. At that time I was based in New York, and was happy doing international development work. And then 9/11 happened. I was working on Wall Street. I was actually at Rikers Island that morning doing a training for youth on entrepreneurship. And I have a twin brother who worked in the World Trade Towers. So my twin brother was there on September 11th in New York, and he was a few floors below the first building that was hit. And when it was hit, they didn't know what happened. He ran down to the bottom floor and luckily made it on time. And as he got outside, the building collapsed, and he ran and was able, thank God, was able to get away. And that morning, I had come across the Brooklyn Bridge and was trying to find him all morning. Cell phones weren't working if you were in New York. I was running through the World Trade Center area where buildings were collapsing. It was a very visual, painful moment. People were running through, covered with chalk. The buildings were collapsed, and I couldn't find my brother. So I finally did find him at 1 or 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and he was fine. And to me, I had always been interested in peace. I come from a huge Irish family where I'm the only girl. There's 6 kids. There's five of us, and I was always interested in conflict and the dynamics of families and people, and so I'd really always been interested in psychology and sociology. And at that moment, I really thought I have to go and focus on conflict prevention, and why people are drawn to violence, and how we can change that. After 9/11, I went back to graduate school at American University. And did a series of I then some ended up in post-conflict development, really focused, doing a lot of different consultancies. I had done some work with Mercy Corps, then was the executive director of Women's Campaign International, which is an organization that worked to increase the number of women in peace building and in parliaments. And I'm a big advocate for more representation of women in elected office and in different formal processes. So I had been there for a number of years, and I was actually traveling in the late 2000s to a lot of conflict zones. I'd been in Afghanistan, I was in Liberia, and while we were doing peace building work, working on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Liberia, I had spent about 6 weeks traveling the country of Liberia doing an assessment. They had just come to the end of decades of conflict, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf was elected president. It was a very hopeful time. But we were traveling through with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, hearing women's stories of the war. And it just was a moment for me where I thought, I've been focused too much on the post-conflict side of this and of this work, and not enough on the preventative side. And both sides are really needed, but it was a moment where I thought I should and can be doing more to try to be building peace before a conflict occurs.
What were some of the stories that you heard from these women that caused that switch to occur?
It was really horrific stories of rape and torture and stories that you just can't repeat. I can't tell somebody else's story of torture, but I will say that we supported the Truth and Reconciliation commissioners, and one commissioner was a friend of mine, and of the commission. She just lost a lot of weight, and she talked about how the heaviness of this work and how much the commissioners take in. Every single person you talk to had a story, whether it's a son or a husband or a child, a daughter dying, whether it's horrible torture and rape. And it was a moment, and I do think at AFSC we actually also focus on the post-conflict side. We do post-conflict work, but we really try to generate and mobilize the peace movement to try to do everything we can in areas of conflict to prevent that tipping point of violence. And I felt that there wasn't enough. I felt that we could be doing more as an international community, and this position at AFSC became available, and I applied and have been there since. And it's a wonderful fit. It's a great organization, and I do think that the trajectory of my career has enabled me to be at a very good space here, where we can look at how do we try to prevent the conflict? And then once we're in a country, if there is perpetual conflict, we work in many conflict-affected countries where they've been in a state of conflict for decades. So what happens then? What happens to the psyche of people? How do we help them to reconcile? How do we help to reduce trauma, while at the same time trying to break down those systems of oppression as well?
Mm-hmm. Now, are you a Quaker, or do you identify as a Quaker?
I am a follower of Quaker values. So you can actually go through a formal process where you join a meeting, which I have not done. I'm a Catholic by birth, and I very much align with the Quaker values.
And so what was that process or experience like, where AFSC, being an organization rooted in Quaker values, obviously you were aware of those values and principles prior to joining, but in the 4 years that you've been there since, what have you come to learn about these Quaker values as you see it manifest in the work that they do? Like, how have you come to understand Quakerism differently, if at all, since joining AFSC?
Yeah, that's a good question. By being with Quakers in places where they do actually worship. So the thing that was most difficult for me is to sit in silence for a long period of time.
I can see that.
But there is something, so I do think just even the experience of being at AFSC makes me a better person, a more patient person, one that, it helps me to second guess my initial impulses and to be a bit more thoughtful. So, it's hard. There is an expression: ask if you want to understand Quakers, or if you've met one Quaker, you've met one Quaker.
I like that.
So there is a sense of what Quakerism is. There's such huge diversity of beliefs, and even from faith beliefs, spiritual beliefs, values within the Quaker society, that it's hard to articulate just one position. It is, but I do think that idea of this light in everybody is one that underlines all of our work. We really seek an equality and a dignity of all that is different, I think, than other NGOs, because we really do. I mean, and we do. This is something that we ground our staff in. That we really say, like, it's not enough to say, yes, I believe all people are equal. You have to show it in every action that you take, in all of your interactions with partners, and the way that you interact with communities. So yeah, but you learn, and like all faiths, where I'm learning. I know much more about it 4 years on than obviously I did when I first started, but there is so much more to know about it, and it's quite fascinating, and I think it's a wonderful belief system.
Are you still a practicing Catholic?
No.
No. Okay. All right.
Although I do love the Pope.
I was going to say, I was like, let's talk about the Pope for a little bit there.
Love this
Yeah.
new Pope. Yeah. I stopped practicing Catholicism. As I said earlier, I'm a very strong believer in women's right to lead and the lack of representation of women in elected offices. And I left in my teens because I just could not align with the Catholic position on women in leadership. And so I can't get over that. Although I still will say this new Pope is quite inspiring and hopeful.
Maybe bringing you back?
Nah, but
Okay,
but it's still hopeful.
Yeah. Are your parents, your brothers, they still practicing Catholics?
Yes. My mother is a very strong Catholic. My father has passed. He was not as practicing Catholic, though a very moral and wonderful man. And yes, they're passive Catholics.
Okay,
Yeah,
okay. I ask because I think sometimes when people leave the faith in which they're born into, based off of a realization, in your case, the role, leadership of women, and in various circles, not just the church, but other places as well, it can potentially cause some conflicts within the family itself. Did you experience any of that? Did you kind of walk out of the faith and saying, I can no longer endorse this, I'm doing this other thing? What was that like for you in your teens of all ages when you decided to?
I think it was painful for my mother and my grandmother. I think my mother has gotten over it, but my grandmother was very religious. And she died right before I was about to give birth. But I do think it would have been very upsetting to her if I did not baptize my children. And it was to my mother, and she did get over it. But yeah, that's conflict. That exists in family.
Yeah. So you mentioned something earlier about two things. One, the practice of sitting in silence. It's a Quaker tradition, and that you initially found that very difficult. I want to unpack that a little bit with you. And then also this sense of Quakers struggling with, are we doing enough? Constantly challenging our assumptions in what we're doing.
Yeah.
So let's tackle that one first.
Sure.
For you, when have you stopped, when you're overseeing all these international programs in 17 different countries around the world?
Yeah.
When have you stopped and said, you know what, are we doing enough in this region or in this country, or are we doing the right thing in this country or region? When have you really had to stop and check yourself and say, we need to ask ourselves this question?
Yeah. So there's two instances where we did this. This is happening all the time at a smaller level, but at a large level. So at one point, I was going through a hiring process, and we are an organization that has very strong beliefs in inclusiveness and diversity, and we were looking at who we were getting to apply for this position, and it was based in Asia, and we were only getting white Americans to apply for it. So it had been brought to my attention that we have a problem here, that we were not getting people from the community for Asians applying for this position, and it wasn't diverse at all. The position had been empty for a while, and we wanted it filled. We really wanted to move and get it filled. But we paused, and we ended up filling it with somebody who was from Europe, who was a fabulous, wonderful person, but it led us to a process to unpack our hiring practices, to really look at Simple things like job descriptions. Are we networking in the right place? We say that we're looking for diverse communities of people to apply, but are we really doing the groundwork that's needed to do that? And we put in place a plan that was multi-years, and we're making some progress there. But that was a moment where, and I think actually in retrospect, that was a few years ago, I may have even done it in a more, I may have even called off the search and said, let's get this done differently. Let's see what the issue is before we fill it. I'm glad I didn't, because I like the person who's in place is fabulous. But it is one of those things where sometimes we've come to a point, I think, at the organization where sometimes you have to stop and unpack the problem internally before you can go out externally. So that was one example. The other example is this shared security work. We spent a lot of time. We have this new vision for how do we influence policy to create alternatives to violence. And I was at a meeting in DC with very progressive heads of government agencies, and we had been talking about the Syrian conflict, and this was a few years ago. And we had asked in this group, there were about 50 people, does anybody in this room think that there are nonviolent alternatives to end the war in Syria, diplomatic or political solutions? And at that point, out of 50 people in the room, only 2 of us raised their hands. I was one, and the other person was also a Quaker. So at that point, it just struck me that there was lack of imagination and investment within some of the leading communities that are working on foreign policy to look at peaceful solutions. And that really was a moment where I thought we have to go out and do more. So we've created this shared security framework where we're hiring policy staff in all of the regions to convene local leaders closest to conflict, come up with real practical solutions, and then to amplify that and really serve as a bridge to different global power centers. And we're looking always at influencing and getting those policy recommendations out in DC, but we're also looking at how do we work with regional bodies. There's many power centers, there's many policy centers around the world. If we're working on a conflict in Burundi, how are we working with the African Union? How are we looking at election violence systems and early warning systems? So we're real, and how is that rooted in community and grounded from the people who have the experience? We know every day people are doing very brave work around the world to prevent conflict, to mediate, to negotiate. And those stories of success are not always heard. How do we document that and lift that up to the greater international community?
Yeah, that's really challenging. You mentioned something, earlier on as we were talking about that shift you had from doing post-conflict work to pre-conflict work. And the age-old challenge of peace builders is a lot of people don't look to something until it becomes a crisis or it becomes a tragedy. On the news, you don't report today a hurricane didn't happen, or today everyone went to school and came home safely and went to bed and were tucked in at night. It's only if something tragic happens that all of a sudden resources or ideas or imagination, as you said, innovation is directed towards that. How have you as an individual or AFSC as an organization help create that shift where money, resources, attention, imagination, creativity goes towards prevention? Even though something horrible hasn't happened yet, people have not died or people are not being marginalized, but prevention work needs to happen. How do you get policymakers to make that switch?
Yeah, I think that's the eternal challenge, right? And I think that there needs to be more more organizations and groups that are working together to try to call for that. So using election violence as an example, too often a lot of funding comes in 9 months before an election. So we know that elections are triggers for violence. We know it. It's been a well-documented phenomenon, but yet we come in less than a year before with a ton of money, try to mobilize organizations, maybe the ones that were doing all the groundwork, maybe not. And then we want to leave 3 months after an election, when sometimes the election happened peacefully, but sometimes not. And often there's simmering conflicts and tension, and there's still residual hostility that could spark some kind of larger conflict. So I think it's up to us as the international community to be funding longer term prevention. So for AFSC to say we're not going to go in there and just fund a year of work. We're going to go and fund in 3 to 5 year cycles, because that's what it takes at a minimum to create sustainable change. And I think if we can document, we're really trying hard to document our successes, even that preventative success. How do we know what might have occurred? And we're trying lots of different innovative ways. We're studying narrative. We're looking at what happens when narrative change, and is that a way that we could demonstrate some progress in peace strategies? So we know that it is difficult, but we know that is what's necessary. We've been most successful. At AFSC, one of our most successful pieces of work has been on the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa. And our staff started linking the U.S. civil rights movement with the Pan-African and anti-apartheid movement in Africa in the 50s. So decades of work occurred. We were doing whatever we could to support those efforts in South Africa. AFSC then was one of the first organizations to divest from companies that were profiting from the apartheid movement, from the from that environment. So that was in the 80s. So that was 30 years of work that to see some kind of really huge structural change. And of course, AFSC was not the only large NGO. There were so many that were working towards it. So we know that we have to work better together. We know that we have to have patience. We have to be more patient. And this is something that Quakers try to bring to this work. We have to celebrate those small successes, but we have to look for the ultimate goal of transformation. It's not going to happen in many cases in a year. And even if it does, it usually means there's a decade behind it of organizing on the ground with partners that isn't seen.
You're listening to The Peace Frequency, a podcast series searching for ways to create a world free of violent conflict. I'm your host, Darren Cambridge, and on the show today, we're speaking with Kerri Kennedy. She's the Associate General Secretary for International Programs at the American Friends Service Committee, a Quaker peace organization working in 17 countries around the world. Well, I want to go back. We talked about sitting in silence and that being a Quaker thing. I do want to touch on that. We're going off on some wonderful tangents here, but I do want to get to that. And you just mentioned patience. What you just mentioned reminds me of something that George Lopez, he teaches a course called Strategic Peace Building. And on many occasions, he said, we can't expect a 3-month peace process to address what has been a 30-year violent conflict that has affected a generation.
Yes.
In many ways, a 30-year violent conflict necessitates, or we shouldn't be surprised to realize that it requires a 30-year peace process. So I want to connect that to the sitting in silence. And you said that was one thing that you found very difficult when embracing and getting introduced to Quaker practice, Quaker values. The first time, do you remember the first time you went to Quaker meeting and sat in silence? What was that experience like for you? And upon reflection, why do you think you found it so difficult?
Yeah. So the first time I sat in silence was actually during my interview.
Wow.
Let's see. It's a lengthy interview process. It was all day. And written into my schedule was a 30-minute meditation.
Wow.
So time, and they put me in a room. So I was in a room called the Peace Room. It's a beautiful room in our office in Philadelphia. That has you're surrounded by windows, and it's quite beautiful. And I had to sit there for 30 minutes, and I was interviewing all day, so I didn't have a computer. I didn't have other things with me. I did at that point have a BlackBerry.
Uh-oh.
And I was sitting there typing my messages thinking, I wonder if I'm being taped. Am I being judged for this? But it was very hard for me to do that. I am action oriented. I'm always on the go. I have a lot of energy, and sometimes I think you go into this type of work because you have a lot of energy and you're seeking kind of big moments, and so I have a lot of adrenaline. I do a lot of things that are, sports that are adrenaline type sports, and I'm like that. So it was hard. Although I do love to read, I like to write. I love these quiet moments as well. It was hard to sit in a room and be quiet. And when in the silence, you are meant to be opening yourself up to have some kind of inspiration that's beyond your calling. So
That's how they described it to you when
yeah,
they okay.
yes, that you're meant, you might be led to something. um so sometimes it was fascinating. It's been fascinating to hear the things that do come from people and that are brought up in meeting. um and you find some of the meetings are very active and people are talking throughout it, and some are silent for the whole hour or half an hour. And I now, as the mother of two young boys, can't ever believe that I did not want to sit in silence. Because I am now absolutely
gift, yeah.
delighted to sit. And I do actually, I think it's made me more meditative. It's made me a better manager. It's made me a better leader. I think it's made me a better mother. People really talk about the value of meditation. And so I am doing a type of meditation and sitting in silence. And it does bring a peace that I think is critical to our work as peace builders. I think that I'm more effective, somebody that's a little bit calmer and can sit still and hear and reflect than I was 4 years ago.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, meditation, mindfulness. We mentioned before we started the interview, I have a 4-year-old daughter, and we sometimes use the Tibetan singing bowl.
Oh yeah.
And wow, I mean, it really does transform a situation when there's a heightened state of conflict between parent and child or amongst everyone in the home. Sometimes like we all need to just go and listen to this bowl sing, and you can just see it in the looks in their eyes and their mouth and their body posture. It's pretty amazing. But yeah, I downloaded one of these meditation apps that's supposed to make it so easy for you to just take 10 minutes a day. And I can't be consistent with it.
Yeah.
And I'm like, this is a problem.
Come work at AFSC.
Yeah.
You'll get it.
Okay. So this is something that you do every day, or you?
No, we don't do it. No, not every day. Well, we are a faith-based organization. We function like a normal organization. Although when we do have big meetings, important meetings or formal meetings, we usually start with a moment of silence. And in our governing meetings, we would go to maybe monthly. I'm going to a meeting on a weekend, or to a meeting for workshop where you're sitting in silence. Okay. And meetings are some meetings meet monthly, some meetings meet more regularly. So there's different patterns to the meeting time. But it's something that is. It sometimes also at AFSC, if we are having a difficult conversation, whoever's leading the meeting might ask for a moment of silence. So that's another mediation strategy that we use. And it's really just a form of practice to say, okay, we're not getting anywhere. And I now try to do this in all of my endeavors with my staff and with colleagues. If we're not coming to some kind of consensus, if we're not really having a difficult, can't resolve this, let's take a moment. Let's think. Sometimes we reflect on a quote. Sometimes we just take a few minutes and just sit in silence and then try to come back to it. So it breaks up, as you said, that tension, and allows you to restart in a very purposeful way. And that's what I like about it. It's being purposeful. It's like we really try to be as purposeful and as intentional and as kind and as truthful as possible.
So you said sometimes you think on a quote. Is there any quote that you use a lot, or someone else has used?
Yeah. I was just in Geneva at a meeting and with the CUNO Geneva office, and one of the staff brought this quote, Nelson Mandela's. There is that was, when you climb to the top of the mountain, you can rest on that mountain, but That's only one of many to come.
Mm.
And I think, and it's not the exact words, but I think that's something that I reflect on a lot. Like we often get to a point of success and said, okay, well, we checked this off. We did this. We improved this process. We transformed this conflict. We're good. And that's never the mindset as a Quaker or as a peace builder that you can ever get into. You're always looking at we have so a long life, and there's a lot of injustices to tackle, and there's a lot of conflicts to transform. And when we get to the top of one, I don't think we can't rest kind of on our laurels. We always have to be looking broader. What else can we be working on? What's the next mountain? So that's something I reflect on.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's fascinating. I want to go back to something you said earlier about, as an external actor, trying not to play a role that can be or is already being played by a local organization or community.
Yeah.
Are there any, can you share with us an example of a local organization that is doing very imaginative, transformative work that deserves to be better acknowledged or highlighted? So your work with AFAC, you've come across them and said, wow, they're doing this amazing work. We don't need to be doing it. We need to be supporting them, but it's pretty unique, or it's transformative in what it does in any of the regions in which you work. And I ask this question as you ponder on it because it reminded me of another one of our colleagues here at USIP, Jackie Wilson. She uses this metaphor that she picked up, that is, any seed that you plant must be watered with the rain that falls in that location.
Absolutely.
And must be nourished by the sun that shines on that that place. So,
that's right.
Yeah.
Well, so for instance, in Burundi, there was a contentious election recently, and we have been involved in efforts to. We've been in Burundi for a number of years, almost a decade, doing income generating work, also with trauma healing and social cohesion. There had been, they have had decades of war, and they were just really coming to this peaceful place, and had an election which was had been contentious, and there was some violence. And there were local groups. We were working with a coalition of civil society groups that really were instrumental in pushing for Burundi to try to have a peace and reconciliation commission. There was a group that was founded to do early warning violence prevention, which of course is who you need to be doing the early warning violence prevention, the people that are in the community where violence is happening. So it often, we see international experts coming in to do a lot of this, the violent prevention or systems analysis, and there is less promotion and attention given to civil society actors like those in Burundi that are doing this work on the ground every day. So we find it to be our job to support them, the civil society, in whatever way that we can, and then also to bring their voice back to DC, to bring their voice back to the African Union and other places. So Burundi is a good example where there's a lot of great work happening on the ground that we're trying to amplify.
So backing way up before your time in the Peace Corps, I'd like to hear where you grew up. And did you grow up in an international way? Like, did you travel a lot growing up? Because now, as we mentioned in your bio, you've worked in over 40 countries. You clearly travel a lot, so you must like it to some extent. Was your childhood, did it take you around the world? And
No, it did not. So I grew up in New Jersey, in North Jersey, so not far from here. And I had very, very happy middle class upbringing. It was, I have, as I said, 5 brothers. 3 of those brothers are older half brothers who I always lived with, who were raised by my mother and my father, and a twin and a younger brother. So we had a very joyous. My father was a restaurateur and managed different restaurants, owned and managed restaurants, and my mother was a teacher. And we traveled. I did not leave the country until I went into the Peace Corps.
Wow.
Yes.
Your first
My first
was to the
overseas
Kingdom of
trip
Tonga.
was to the Kingdom of Tonga. So all of our vacations were to the beach. We love the beach, the Jersey Shore.
Yeah.
With 5 kids, you're going in the
Yeah.
car and you're driving to the shore. And we skied a lot
Okay.
locally. So first, yes, I made up for that lack of international travel.
Seriously.
And my family are not huge travelers, normal amount of
Yeah.
vacations, but they're quite happy in going locally for vacations. But I had a very, very joyful upbringing, and it struck me, a very privileged middle class upbringing, and it struck me deeply when I realized that was not everybody's experience. And when I realized how lucky I was to be born an American in New Jersey, a white woman, that the privilege that comes with that. And I had felt, my family has always been the kind of justice oriented, and my family has very, I think, had always had a strong sense of right or wrong and what's moral. And I just felt like it was my calling to do whatever I could to use that privilege to help to transform systems of oppression wherever I could.
Hmm. So having never traveled abroad, what inspired you to do the Peace Corps? That's a big jump.
Yeah, the Peace Corps is just a romantic, that's something that sounded like, for a young idealist in college, was just like the perfect thing that one could do. And it was a wonderful, I highly recommend it to anybody thinking about it. It's a great transformational experience. I was on this tiny little island. And I built a small school there with the community. We built there on this little island. They were bringing in electronics. There was no electricity in the island, so they were bringing in cars and radios and generators, and people didn't know how to fix them. There wasn't a mechanical school there. So after assessing that was a need, we got some funding and built a small school that did mechanical engineering. It was a little, 2-room house school that was training people to repair these things, and it was wonderful. And I did a little bit of HIV/AIDS work. One of my older brothers died of HIV/AIDS in the 90s, and there was a lot of stigma, as we know in the United States. There was also a huge amount of stigma in the South Pacific, and that was something that had been, the AIDS rates were increasing. So I used that experience to talk a lot about my personal experience and to try to destigmatize AIDS and testing around AIDS.
So actually that leads me to another question of, you mentioned earlier, growing up, privileged, middle class, white woman, New Jersey, United States, got a lot of things working in your, quote, favor, I guess you could say. Then you have those moments where you are exposed to injustice or oppression. It can be in your own neighborhood, it can be in the United States. Do you remember when that first hit you and you said, not everybody in the world lives like this, and in fact a lot of people in the world live under intolerable conditions, and so I'm going to dedicate some of my time or use my privilege to be able to address that? Can you recall a moment where that injustice just really struck you?
It has always struck me, and it's funny because I see it in my son. I mean, because I lived in North Jersey, I was often in cities and urban centers, and when I was growing up, it was a lot different than it is today. There was a lot of homelessness. There was a lot of even more than there is today in New York and in the cities of Newark, and so I had always felt that injustice, that somebody in this world could not have a home and could not have food from birth. Really, I mean, it was always, it is interesting because I now see it with my children, that when they see somebody on the street with a sign, their first reaction is, what can we do to help? We started packing actually fruit and sandwiches when we drive on a Saturday. There's often a road that we drive in Philadelphia where we live, where there's a lot of homeless people with signs. And because we have had this conversation about how some people experience difficult times, we started carrying this food and handing it around. And my son at that time was 4, asked to start doing that. So So I think that was fostered and encouraged in me, that helpfulness. I think my family fostered it, and I'm trying to do that for my children. And I think that there's a lot of love and a lot of beauty in this world, and there's a lot of horrible injustice and pain and violence. And I think as humans, we have an obligation to call it out whenever we see it, and to fight against it, and to try to protect each other as humankind, as members of this same kind of global family. So I'm privileged that I'm able to get to do work that allows me to do that every day.
Yeah, I think I was speaking with a colleague of mine just the other day who had a similar story with one of her sons. They were overseas and they were at a fruit market, and a lot of the workers there, I mean, they're just treated like machines.
Yeah.
And the owner of the plantation essentially, would hit the workers if they weren't keeping up with the pace of sorting various types of fruit. And, her son immediately saw this and said, this is horrible. This is wrong. This is unjust. Maybe not using that word, but just being a human being before you're programmed in later years to justify certain things or make sense of certain things, it hits you viscerally that is not right. That's another human being. I don't care what color they are. I don't care what gender they are. That shouldn't be happening. And it reminded me of, this is the Robert Kennedy quote that he used a lot. I think it was George Bernard Shaw was the originator of it, and I'm not going to say it exactly, but it's something along the lines of, some people see the world the way it is and ask why. Other people see the way it could be and ask why not. And, I think a lot of the value of the work that you've been doing in AFSC is you're not about programming people to see the world the way it currently exists and help people understand why it is, and then learn how to operate within that framework.
Right.
There's gross inequality, and here's why.
Right.
And so if you want to operate in a world that has tremendous amounts of inequality and injustice, here's how you avoid that, or you take advantage of that, or you can justify why you're on one end of it or the other, as opposed to, no, that's wrong. It doesn't have to look this way or work this way. We don't have to treat each other this way. So let's be creative, let's be imaginative, and think differently about how we treat each other, how we share our resources and things like that. And, I don't know when it is. It's probably different for different kids, but, your sons are probably reaching that age. My daughter's probably reaching that age where they start to get those subtle messages of, this is the way it is. And so start to see yourself this way or treat other people that way so you can be successful in the world the way it is, as opposed to, no, hold on to that anger that you see and transform it.
Right. And we see it in children. They know when something's unjust. My sons, even my almost 3-year-old, knows when somebody is not being treated right. So, how do we cultivate that? How do we allow them to keep that? And how do we try to reduce the conditioning that occurs? It was very interesting. My son, this is different from conflict, but it is the socialization of children. My son wanted to be Sky, which is a character from a show for Halloween.
The Paw Patrol?
Paw Patrol, yeah. Yeah. Yes. And no, Sky's a girl. Sky's a female dog. And so my son came home and said, we talked about Halloween. He said, what do you want to be? He wanted to get dressed up in a costume. And he said, oh, I want to be Sky, but I don't think I can. And I said, why can you not be Sky? And he said, because Sky's a girl. I said, of course you can be Sky. And then, so I said, what are other people in your class being? And he said, so-and-so is going to be a doctor. So-and-so will be a fireman. So-and-so is going to be broccoli. And I said, so you're saying that your friend can be broccoli, a vegetable, and you can't be a girl? But it was, it happens. And I think it's our job as parents and as peace builders to try to peel away those layers and to try to get back to the roots of our humanity. And this is something that Quakers are really good at. Let's peel away all of the other stuff and see the dignity and the humanity in all of us. And how, when you do that, you have an obligation to treat people differently and to engage in the world in a different way.
Yeah. Well, we're coming to the end of our time here, but I wanted to go back to this concept of Quakers and AFSC to a certain extent being a gadfly to the state. I think this analogy to children understanding injustice and holding on to that anger and then making life decisions, advocating for certain things based off of that anger has been, or I understand it to be, part of what makes Quakers unique and what makes AFSC unique, because you have found yourselves in a position where you have to speak out against a dominant narrative
Yes.
or a dominant policy that endorses or relies on violence or perpetuates injustice, and it puts your organization in a position of speaking truth to that, to the U.S. government or other governments for that matter. What challenges does that pose, and what opportunities does that present to you as an individual, but also to the organization to be in that role?
Yeah. So throughout our history, we have always, AFSC, we've been around for about 100 years, and we've always we've used a number of different approaches to do our work. So we do advocacy, we do quiet diplomacy, we do peace building, and we have to figure out how to do that together and how to complement that. So for instance, if we're doing operational peace building work in a country, and yet we're speaking out about if we're speaking about a policy to the U.S. government or to the country government, we might put people at risk. So that's always a balance. AFSC and I think Quakers in general are willing to do risky things and to be courageous and to be willing to be imprisoned or to suffer for our beliefs. And that's something that has been a long tradition with Quakers. Quakers have always been willing to die, to be imprisoned for their beliefs. And that's something that we hold true. We have to go as far as possible to stand up for some truth. At the same time, one thing that I think is a challenge is that we always work with all sides of a conflict. So it's in this age of increasing isolation and in a time where people are recommending disengagement as a strategy, it is difficult for us to operate. We have, for instance, there are a lot of regulations from the U.S. government, restrictions on groups that we can interact with. But we say, well, if we're trying to build peace in a country, we have to be able to work with all parties, including armed actors who might be called a terrorist group by some governments. So that's a real challenge. That's like a legal challenge. It's a challenge for us. It's a restriction for peace builders. And that's something that we have to advocate against, but at the same time, we do have to work with the governments that are implementing that strategy. So it's always a balance to see how do you engage with all parties to try to break down restrictive practices and policies, but also to try to come together to some kind of constructive solution. This is something that we have done historically, and this adding the shared security framework is reinvigorating that in our current organization. At one point, I was talking about our work in Gaza in the 40s. AFSC, one of the directors, was asked to be the mayor of Jerusalem in 1947 because they thought that Quaker would be the only person that might be able to negotiate some peace. And it ended up not happening for a number of reasons, but it was, Quakers do have this history of being able to engage in a way that's respectful, that's truthful, that speaks truth to power, but that can engage with groups that are oppressing and groups that are being oppressed and try to bring them together for some shared solution. So that's always a challenge. And it's a challenge when you're working in many different countries that have different levels of restriction. How do you make sure that you're taking those risks while serving a duty of care and making sure people are protected and not being foolish, but really are not taking unnecessary risks, but that they're thoughtful, they're strategic, and they're well planned.
You have been listening to The Peace Frequency, a podcast series searching for ways to create a world free of violent conflict. On today's show, we've been speaking with Kerri Kennedy. She's the Associate General Secretary for International Programs at the American Friends Service Committee. Kerri, this has been an absolute pleasure and joy to spend this time with you and hear your story and more about the work that you do. So thank you very much.
Oh, thank you. It was a pleasure for me too. Always good to talk to you.
The Peace Frequency is produced by the Global Campus, USIP's online learning platform designed to strengthen your peace building skills through distance learning courses, multimedia toolkits, and virtual live events. You can learn more about the Global Campus at usipglobalcampus.org. Our on-air producer has been Vanessa Francis. Our sound engineer and theme music composer is Timothy O'Keefe. Is Timothy O'Keefe. Our graphic designer is Manuel Leon. And I've been your host, Darren Cambridge. Thanks to our listeners for tuning in. Be sure to check the Peace Frequency website to access a recording of this show and other archived episodes of this podcast. The URL is usipglobalcampus.org/peace-frequency. Again, that's usipglobalcampus.org/peace-frequency. Until then, keep learning, supporting, and building peace.